Today we're going to be learning Masechet Yoma Daf Kaf Zayin. Today is the Daf for Shabbat. Today's Daf is dedicated by Deborah Hamilton in honor of Susan Rosenberg's birthday, with love from the women of IAM who wish Susan a day of her favorite things, including a swim at the point, chocolate-covered pomegranate, and learning with the amazing women of Hadran. Happy birthday. We're going to start from the bottom. We saw a Mishnah which talked about how many Kohanim you needed for all the different types of animals. In terms of, we talked about burning the different parts on the altar. Now we're going to move to the Gemara, which starts off with Tana. So we're at the bottom of Kaf Amud Bet, and we say, Hapshetan v'nituchan shavim bezav. The taking off of the hide of the animal and also cutting it up into pieces can be done by a non-Kohen. A zar is someone who's not a priest, not from the priest family. Amar Chizkiah, minayin lefshei v'nituach sheshaveh bezar. From where do we know this? To which he quotes a verse. And before we read this verse, I'm going to read you a bunch of the verses from the very beginning of Sefer Vayikra. So Sefer Vayikra starts off and says, Vayikal Moshe v'daber Hashem elav me'ol moed limor. God starts speaking to Moshe. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta lehem. Adam ki yakri mikem korban la'Hashem. If you're going to bring a korban, which is a voluntary burnt offering, and then it proceeds to say whether it's from the cattle or from the herd or the flock, right, the sheep family. Im ola korbanom min habakar. If you're going to bring a korban ola, a burnt offering, zachar tamim yaklivenu. Okay, you bring a male. Well, we're not going to get into this now. Pasuk 4, Dalid. V'samach yado al rosh haola v'nirtza lo lechaper alav. So first you put your hands on the ola, on the offering, and you push your weight down. That's called smicha. Then v'shachat et ben habakar. Then you slaughter. Now we're talking specifically about the bakar, if it's cattle, from the cattle family. You slaughter the ben bakar l'fnei Hashem, before God. V'ikrivo b'nei Aharon ha'kohanim et hadam. All of a sudden we see, till now, we seem to be talking about a person who wants to bring a korban. It seemed like all the actions possibly could have been done by him. Now we start to see the b'nei Aaron coming in. So now it says, v'ikrivo b'nei Aharon ha'kohanim et hadam. They bring the blood. Okay, and they understand it's not just the holacha, moving the blood and then sprinkling it on the altar, but also accepting the blood. So from here, we're going to learn that before that, you don't need kohanim. After that, you need kohanim. Now it says it should be flayed and cut up into sections, but it doesn't say kohen specifically. So we don't really know. And then all of a sudden it goes back to Bnei Aaron. It says, and they should put the fire on the altar, and they should organize the wood on the fire. We'll talk about what that is soon. Then again, you get, and the sons of Aaron, the Kohanim, should put the nitachim, they should put the pieces and the head and the pader, which is unclear exactly what it means. Some people say it's the fats. Let's just go with that right now. It's not so important. They put the parts on the altar. That's what we saw in our Mishnah. You wash the innards out because they're disgusting. Now he, the Kohen, again, the Kohen's the subject here, he burns everything on the altar. Then it proceeds to say, what if you bring up minatzon? That's not what we're talking about. We're in the section of the cattle. Now, if you noticed, it said the Kohen many times. Now, theoretically, you might have said it doesn't, maybe you need to repeat it all the time. And that's what our Gemara is going to try to do. Try to figure out when it's necessary, when it's not necessary. And if it's not necessary, then what is it teaching us? So comes Chizkiah and he says, how do we know that Hefshet and Nituach can be done by anybody? Because it says, V'natnu b'nei Aaron HaKohen esh al HaMizbeach, which comes to teach you. Remember, it says they put the fire on the Mizbeach. And that came right after the verse about the flaying the animal and cutting it up into sections. So it seems like they weren't mentioned in Pasuk Vav, and they were mentioned in Pasuk Zayin, which is the one about the fire. So we learn from here, Nitinat Esh Baya Kehuna, Hefshef Nituach Lo Baya Kehuna. So since you need, right, the fire needs Kehuna, but not the flaying of the animal. So now the Gemara rejects this and says, what are you talking about? You need that verse to teach about itself. You needed to know, it's not, in order to make a drasha and say this is here to exclude something else, You have to have it that it's unnecessary in that verse. And the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's necessary to teach you that he puts the fire on the altar. You might have thought he doesn't. So therefore, that's why it needs to tell you that and not coming to exclude the flaying of the animal. So Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi, Eshkachte la'Abaye dehava masbir leila b'rei. I saw Abaye teaching his son the following. V'shachat, shchita b'zar kshera. Because it says v'shachat, and this is how I read it to you, this is the earlier pasuk, you slaughter the animal, and only after that does it say, and then the Kohen does the blood. So from there you learn that shchita b'zar kshera. V'chi me'ayin bat. Where'd you get this from? Michlal shene'emar v'atau b'necha yitcha tishmur et kunatchem. Shome'ani afilu shchita. Because there's another verse that says you and your sons should take care of the kuna and protect it, and it's only things are only for Kohanim. You might have thought it includes shchita, because whenever we talk about the 4 rituals of the main rituals, we talk about slaughtering, accepting the blood, walking the blood to the altar, and sprinkling the blood. So this is one of the main 4. So wouldn't you think only Aaron and his sons could do it? Meaning only Kohanim. Talmud Lomar. But because it says in the verse, they slaughter it. And then it says, and the sons of Aaron come in and do the blood. Then we learn from here, only from the time they accept the blood, that the Kohanim are supposed to do it. But anything that comes before that, smicha, and by putting your weight on the animal and slaughtering, are clearly not. So if that's the case, if you're going to say the Kohanim are involved in everything from the time of when they accept the blood and past that, beyond that, then you don't need to tell us. Okay, 2 minutes ago, let's start from the beginning. We tried to bring this verse, but it's extra unnecessary. It's to teach you that this, yes, but not the previous pasuk about flaying the hide and cutting the animal up. But then we said, no. You need to know that who's supposed to put the fire on the altar? The Kohen. And that's why you need that verse to teach about itself and not to exclude something else. Now the Gemara says, no, you really didn't need a pasuk to tell you that the Kohanim do put the wood on the altar, because we already know that they do everything from Kabbalah and beyond. So therefore, lamali so again, why do you need that verse? It's again unnecessary, because once you know they do everything beyond accepting the blood, then of course, what goes after you accept the blood and after you sprinkle the blood on the altar, then you make a fire and then you burn the parts on the altar. So it's one of the stages after Kabbalat Adam. So of course you need a Kohen. You don't need the pasuk. If the pasuk's unnecessary, we can learn from here. It's to exclude Havshet and Nituach. But Akate itzrich. No, we really do still need that verse. Why? Sal kadat achamina kevan delav avodah dema'akva kaparahi lo tibaya kuna. When we say the Kohen does everything from Kabbalah Anam, we mean the main activities, the ones that are critical for having atonement, which are accepting the blood, walking the blood to the altar, and sprinkling the blood. Because in the end, as soon as you sprinkle the blood, you've achieved atonement. It's true you have to burn some parts on the altar, but that's not the main part, and you can still receive atonement without that. Therefore, we're going to say, Kamash malan debaya kuna, and therefore you might have said, okay, let's go back to the beginning of that line. Sal kadat achamina, you might have thought, kevan de lava vadam akva kaparahi, since this idea of putting the wood on the altar is not critical. You can do the sacrifice without it. You're not doing it the right way, but you will achieve atonement. Therefore, maybe you don't need kiuna for it. Kamash malan, therefore, comes to teach you debaya kuna, you actually do. So we basically, in the end, say that pasuk is necessary to teach you that only the Kohanim are allowed to put the wood on the altar, the logs, nobody else. And therefore, the pasuk's not extra. We can't learn from here that the Kohanim don't need to do what was mentioned in the previous verse, which that without the word Kohen in it, Hefshet and Nituach, the flaying the hide and cutting it into pieces. So option number 2, Elamehacha. Let's try to learn it from here. And now we're moving on to 2 psukim later. So again, if I read our psukim, okay, we're in Vayikra chapter 1 again. Okay, now we were up to verse number 6. That's what we read, that the Kohanim put the blood, and then, we even read 7, and then we read 8, v'natnu b'nei Aaron HaKohanim esh al hamizbeach v'archu etzim ala esh. Now we're going to darshan the next part. V'natnu b'nei, I went to the wrong place. Ela mehacha. V'archu b'nei Aaron HaKohanim et hanitachim et harosh ve'et hapader. Okay, now we're up to the pasuk chet. Now they arrange. Who arranges? B'nei Aharon HaKohanim. Again, who arranges it? The Kohanim. Et hanetachim, et harosh, et hapader, al yitzim asher al ha'esh, asher al hamizbeach. So now they arrange all the different parts that have to be burned on the wood, which is on the fire, which is on the altar, which we kind of already knew about, but we'll get to that soon. So again, if we know they're supposed to do everything that's important after the accepting of the blood, maybe you'll say, okay, putting the wood on the altar is not a critical element, but at least putting the parts to burn maybe is pretty important. So then we're going to assume that's part of the category of all the main activities, even if it's not as central as sprinkling the blood, but it's still pretty central. So we might have thought, right, it's obvious. You don't need a verse to tell you that, because again, it's part of the work that they do after the Kabbalah. And so they're supposed to do everything from Kabbalah and on, which we already saw from that verse, right? Shchita and Smicha, which were, I should say Smicha first, and then Shchita, which were before, those could be done by anyone, but after that, any major activities can only be done by a Kohen. So therefore, Archu seems to be unnecessary. Why do we need to know again that the Kohanim do this? Right? You could have just said Archu and not Archu B'nei Aharon HaKohanim. Could have just said Archu and they. Who's they? The Kohanim. So Limi'ut Hefsheh B'nituach. So maybe that's what it's coming to exclude. To which the Gemara questions and says, why are you assuming it's excluding Hefshet and Nituach? Maybe it's excluding something else. Maybe it's coming to say those 2 logs that they put on. Okay, the 2 logs have to be put on both in the morning before the Tamid sacrifice in the morning, and also in the afternoon before the Tamid sacrifice in the afternoon. Maybe it's coming to exclude now. When it comes to the first ones that you do in the morning, it says it explicitly in the verse. Okay, we're now skipping to chapter 6, verse here. Okay, in verse verse number 5 in chapter 6. The ones in the morning the Kohen has to burn. Etc. So we know that has to be done by a Kohen. But our Gemara must be referring to the 2 logs that have to be put on in the afternoon before the Tamid sacrifice in the afternoon, the daily offering. So how do we know that one has to be done by a Kohen? There, it doesn't say the word Kohen in that verse. So therefore, you might have said, maybe this is coming to exclude, maybe that doesn't need to be done by a Kohen. To which the Gemara answers, so now we're basically saying, Archu HaKohen, they put the pieces on the altar to burn. Now, either you can say, that's excluding that who prepares them for going on. Maybe anyone can cut them up into pieces and not only a Kohen, and also taking the hide off. Or maybe it's coming to exclude that you don't have to put the 2 logs on in the afternoon, that anyone can do that, not only a Kohen. To which the Gemara says, if it's going to be either the wood or the flaying and the cutting up of the animal, which one would you rather? Well, mistabra divcha de kavatei mimayit. We should say divcha is Daled and Zayin switch in Aramaic. It's zivcha, like zevach. The one that we were in the pasuk is referring to putting the parts on the altar. And the one that we were referring to, Hefshet and Nituach, is also dealing with the animal itself. The putting the wood on the altar has to do with the altar and something that allows us to burn it, but has nothing to do with the animal. So wouldn't you rather learn something that has to do with the animal itself from something that has to do with the animal itself? And therefore, if we're going to exclude something, let's exclude Hefshet and Nituach. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Adraba, Sidur de Kavatemamayit. Why don't you say no? What's similar about putting everything on the altar, the parts of the animal, and also putting the wood on the altar? Those are both organizing things in a particular place. It's similar in terms of what type of action it is, as opposed to flaying the animal and cutting it up into pieces that have shape and nituach, which are something different. So therefore, the Gemara says you could easily exclude the shnei gzirei eitzim in the afternoon. To which the Gemara says, no can do. Lo salkadatach. I'll tell you why, which again is going to get us back to where we want to be, which is the verse is actually coming to exclude our case of sheit nituach, which is what we're looking for a source for, that a zar can do it. So the Gemara says it can't make sense to say that it's excluding the shnei gzirei eitzim. Ta'amar mar, because here's a source we're going to prove. V'ikriv Aharon et hakol. Okay, we're now jumping to pasuk Yud Gimel in that chapter, in the first chapter of Vayikra. It says, "Ikriv akohen et hakol." He brings everything, Piktira mizbech, and he burns it on the mizbech ola. Everything goes up to God. So now, what do they want to learn from here? Hikriv akohen et hakol al mizbecha. What does that mean? Zoholachat evarim lakevesh. This means it's a special law that the Kohen has to carry the parts of the animal to the altar, to the ramp. Holachat evarim lakevesh hu debaya kiuna. Holachat itzim lo baya kiuna. This is to teach you that bringing something to the altar, what do you have to bring to the altar that Kohen has to do? That's the parts of the animal. But it's again coming to exclude something else that the Kohanim don't need to do, which is they don't need to bring the shnei gzirei eitzim, which means, sorry, my mistake. Holachat evarim lakevesh hu debaya kiuna. Right. Holachat eitzim lo baya kiuna. Sorry. You don't have to bring, I got confused for a minute. You don't have to bring, now there's two parts to the wood on the altar we talked about, the logs. First, they bring these two rows. They make a shti and erev, okay? They do a crisscross. That's the base. After that, they put these two extra ones at the top to make it burn quicker. Now, this is coming to teach you that they have to bring the evarim to the ramp, but they don't have to bring the wood to the ramp. Coming to exclude, you don't need those shti and erev. Anyone can do that. It doesn't have to be done by a Kohen. To which the Gemara says, what can you infer from that? If you don't have to bring those two piles of, right, the crisscross ones, then what do you say? From this Braita, which isn't talking about the two logs, one can infer, though, if you don't need to bring the eitzim for the maracha, the whole setup, the base, but it sounds like a Kohen would need to bring those two logs. In which case, you can say that our verse, right, okay, remember, we brought two verses so far. We tried to say that Nu b'nei Aaron Kohanim esh al mizbeach. That comes to exclude it. We said, no. In the end, you need to teach that case by itself because that's not an important avodah. Therefore, you wouldn't think a Kohanim would need to do it. You need a special pasuk to teach you, in which case you can't learn to have shape and nituach. Then we jump to the next verse. Pasuk, that was pasuk vav. Then we jump to pasuk chet, 8. V'archu et hanitzachim. They're the ones who do the pieces, the parts on the altar. We wanted to say that comes to exclude the hefshet and nituach. To which we said maybe it comes to exclude shnei gzirei eitzim. Maybe Kohanim don't need to do that. But we just proved from this source the Kohanim do need to do the shnei gzirei eitzim. And we just learned it from this source because the source says they don't need to bring all the wood to the altar, but they do need to bring those two logs. Those two logs are different from the other woods. So now back to our main point. Ve'archu lamali. So why do we need this case? Ve'archu, this pasuk must be extra. Because again, you would have known that they're supposed to put the parts on the altar because that's part of the sacrifice. And therefore, we're going to say it's to exclude hefshet and nituach. To which the Gemara says, but maybe this verse also needs to be taught for its own sake. Okay, now why would you need it? Because again, it's true, it's a more central part, but it's still not, right? We already said from the beginning, sprinkling the blood is the main thing. After that, you've got an atonement, even if you don't burn the parts. So maybe you need this for its own sake, in which case maybe you can't learn anything from here, because maybe you wouldn't have known the Kohanim do this without that. To which the Gemara says, Ella, we're going to try pasuk number 3 to try to prove our point. V'iktir hakohen et hakol. Now we're jumping to pasuk tet, the next verse, 9. V'kirbo kra'av yerchatz b'mayim, the innards he rinses out. V'iktir hakohen et hakol hamizbecha. So, and then the Kohen burns everything on the altar. L'mayata. So what's the point here? We already know he burns everything. He already brought all the pieces up. We're going to assume he's the one burning it. So what do you need it for? It must be limiute hefshet v'nituach. Now, okay, so that's now our conclusion. We're actually going to learn it from that verse and not the others. Now the Gemara is going to go back to some of the verses. What is this coming? This is actually the Breita that we just quoted. We're now just quoting it directly, not in the context of a question that we brought up before. But he brings everything to the Mizbeach. This is Pasuk 13. Zo holachat evarim lakevesh, which comes to teach you holachat evarim lakevesh hu debayik yuna. This is just repeating what we saw. Walking them, bringing the parts to the altar, the limbs to the altar to burn them, needs to be done only by a Kohen. But holachat etzim lo bayik yuna. But to bring all the wood for the altar doesn't need to be done by a Kohen. But hasidor shnei gzirei etzim bayik yuna. But you would need the shnei gzirei etzim. That would need a Kohen. And vinatnu legufe. And again, the word vinatnu, where it says vinatnu in pasuk. Now we're going back to the beginning. The Gemara is almost reviewing for us. Natnu is natnu b'nei Aaron esh. That we need legufe. Ve'archu. Now the question is, why does ve'archu have to be legufe? What do we learn from ve'archu b'nei Kohanim? Comes to teach you something else also. Ve'archu is plural, shnayim. B'nei Aaron is shnayim. It's also plural, the sons of Aaron. That's another two. And our Kohanim is shnayim. So what do we learn from those three words? Each word is plural. Well, it's actually more than three words, but those three phrases. Lamanu l'talesh sheta'un shisha. We actually need that verse for a different drasha. I suggested before that maybe that verse is needed to teach we need Kohanim specifically to do it, because maybe it's not an essential part. But here the Gemara doesn't seem to say that. The Gemara seems to offer a different suggestion, which is these words are coming to tell you that when it comes to the Korban Tamid of the lamb, that you need 6 Kohanim to carry the different parts. And this we already saw in the Mishnah on Daf Kafei. So I think it was Kafei. So now that we need for itself. Amar Rav Hamnuna. But Rav Hamnuna says, what are you talking about? How can you possibly learn? Now try to remember something I told you in the beginning. When I read these verses, I said all these verses, they start off with cattle and also from the flocks of sheep. But then it goes into the details of the cattle. And only at the end of this section, it starts to go into, when it gets to Pasuk Yud, which are not the Psukim that we're darshaning, it starts to talk about the tzon, the sheep. Now, you want to learn from the verse that comes before that, which is talking about cattle. You want to learn from the cattle Pasuk that it's talking about the sheep that you bring every day and that they need 6 parts. The Gemara is going to say, right? How could you say that? Amar Rav Hamnuna kasha Rabbi Elazar, or Eliezer, I forget who it is, but he had a problem. What was his problem? It must be Rabbi Elazar, because it's Rav Hamnuna talking, and I assume he's talking about the Amora, Rabbi Elazar. He says, Hi, beben bakar ktiv, uben bakar esrim va'arba abai. What do we see in our Mishnah? And this is why it connects. Our Mishnah said you need 24 kohanim for the bakar, for the cattle. And this is a cattle pasuk. It's talking about cattle. How can you possibly say it's a reference to the 6 kohanim who have to carry the parts of the sheep? Doesn't make any sense. To which the Gemara, but then Rav Hamnuna himself says, "B'nichale." But you know what? I'll explain it. How so? Al ha'itzim asher al esh asher al mizbeach. This was the verse we saw before. Okay, first we saw v'natnu b'nei Aaron HaKohen esh al mizbeach. Remember, they put the fire on, and we saw this. Archu etzim al esh, and then it says again, right? Al ha'itzim asher al esh. Okay, this is from verse 8. And then they set the parts out on the wood that's on the fire that's on the altar. Now, didn't we already talk about the fire and the wood? Why are we adding this again? So he says, where else do we have fire, altar, esh, what was it? And etzim, right? The wood, the fire, and the altar. It's the sheep. So what they're saying is when it starts to talk again about it in Pasuk 9 and Pasuk, actually, sorry. Pasuk Chet, Pasuk 8, verse number 8, where was our Pasuk? Archu b'nei Aaron etachim v'etarosh v'etapader, and we try to say Archu b'nei Aaron kohanim is all to teach us 6. That verse is already segues into the sheep, even though it's certainly not the pshat here. But since those words of the wood and the eitz and the mizbeach are the wood and the fire and the altar are all unnecessary, it must be that we're shifting into something else and we're making a reference to the sheep. That's the end of that section. So again, our structure is very simple, even though it got a little bit complicated. We brought 3 verses to try to prove. 2 of them in the end, we proved that they need to be there for their own sake. And therefore, they can't be used to darshan and to exclude hafshet and nituach. All these verses have, at least we thought at the beginning, maybe unnecessary mention of Aharon and his sons. In the end, we find the verse, which is pasuk 9, when it says at the end, he burns everything on the altar, that's really unnecessary. And from there, we're going to learn he does that, but he doesn't do something else. And that's the flaying and the cutting up into pieces. Now we're going to talk about another thing about zar, someone who's a non-Kohen. We're going to have 2 different readings of what Rav Asi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So here's the first version. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Zar shesideret ha'ma'aracha chayav. If you have a non-Kohen who sets up the ma'aracha, he's chayav. He's obligated the death penalty, meaning he's not allowed to set up the wood. Now, this is different from what we saw before. Now, first of all, chayav means he's obligated death in the hands of God. Okay, very serious. So what does he do if he did do it? He takes it apart and then he puts it back together. Okay, this is really strange. What did that help? He's not allowed to do it. So he takes it apart and he does it again. No, so obviously they meant ela por kazal v'sodra kohen. If you're a non-Kohen and you did it, so you take it off the altar, you take apart all the logs that you put there, and then a Kohen comes along and he does it himself. Okay, that's how it works. Matkifla Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says, wait a minute. Could you possibly have an avodah, one of the rituals in the temple, that can be done at night and yet can't be done by a non-Kohen? In other words, there's this assumption that only the activities that were done during the day, if you remember, when we talk about korbanot, everything really is done during the day. Very little is done at night. So anything that's done during the day is the main thing. Anything that's done at night is generally allowed for a Kohen, a non-Kohen. So you're going to say now there's something that can be done at night and yet the Kohen can't, the zar, a non-Kohen can't do it. To which the Gemara, which is obviously, it seems like you can set up the wood at night. To which the Gemara says below, what do you mean? Of course, there's things we do at night that a non-Kohen can't do. Hello, Bahare, we're going to have two things that we do in the nighttime hours. Bahare, Evarim updarim, right, the limbs and the fats that we burn on the altar. Sof avodah diyamamihi. It's the end of the work of the day. Oh, sorry. First, we have the question. That's already the answer. Hare, Evarim updarim. Those are things we do at night because generally you leave them to burn all night. And a zar can't put them on and burn them. So they say, oh no, that's different. That's sof avodah diyamamahu. That's just the end of the day's sacrifices. What do? You burn the extra parts on the altar. That's still considered a day activity, even though you could do it at night. Because it's the final part of what you did during the day. It's still connected to the day activity. What about Harei Trumat HaDeshen? What about the sweeping of the ashes? That, remember, we talked about, it's done in the middle of the night. Remember, even on the holidays, we did it after the first Ashmorah, the first 4 hours of the night. On Yom Kippur, Chatzot, you do that in the middle of the night. So what do they say? Oh no, and that only a Kohen can do that. So they answer, oh no, that's Tchilat Avodah Diyamama. That's the beginning of the day activities. That's why only a Kohen can do it. But something that's neither here nor there, it's not the first activity of the morning, right? It doesn't lead into the day, like just putting the wood on, that wouldn't be allowed. Okay, so we basically resolved that issue. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. How do we know this? It's Chilat Avodah Diyamama. Kidei she'adav l'trumat hadeshen l'machal ein sarich l'kadesh. If you wash your hands for the trumat hadeshen, the next morning you don't have to wash your hands again. Shekvar kidesh mitchilat avodah, and there we see that it's really the beginning of the day's work, and therefore even if you do it in the middle of the night, it's really considered the beginning of the day, and that's not considered a night activity. If it were a night activity, it really would be pasul for a zar. So again, elakashya, and therefore this really is difficult. How could, in other words, what did he say? If a zar sets up the wood, the logs on the base of the altar, he is obligated. He's not, meaning he gets the death penalty. He's not allowed to do this, even though it's a night activity. That's difficult. So therefore, they changed what he said. This must be what he said. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, or Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Zal shesider shnei gzirei etzim. It's not, and this now matches what we saw in the first side of this page, which was, it's not the wood at the base that goes the crisscross warp and weft, but, or warp and woof, but, Ela zar shesider shnei gzirei etzim chayav. It's the two logs. Then he's obligated the death penalty. That we already saw only a Kohen can do. Ho'il v'avodat Yomi, because this is an avodah that has to be done during the day. So now Rav is going to ask, wait a minute. Matkif la Rav, elameata tibai payis. Then if it's one of the day's work, then it should need one of these lotteries. And we learned about the lotteries that the Kohanim had, and this isn't part of the lottery. So now they say, what do you mean it's not part of the lottery? You forgot what it says in a Braita. Whoever got to do the Trumat HaDeshen, if you got the lottery for that, you also did the setting up of the two sets of logs, the two warp and woof that go across. And in addition, you also do these two logs. So here you see there was a pious about it. So that wasn't a good question. But now we have another question. Lememra, are you supposing that avodat yom by a pious and avodat laila lo by a pious? The work done during the day needs a pious, this lottery, and avodat laila doesn't need, because you seem to be saying, since it's avodat yom and since it's that, and then Rava said, well, if it's avodat yom, it needs pious, which seems to imply if it's not a day activity, it doesn't need pious. But what, again, we're going to have our same questions we had before. Ivarim uptarim need a pious who gets to do it. So again, the answer, same answers as before. Sof avodah diyamami. This needs pious because it's the end of the day's activities. It's connected to the day. And what about the picking up of the ashes, the sweeping of the ashes? Mishum ma'aseh shahaya. That's because that case that we saw in Daf Kafbet, where the Kohanim got into a fight over it, who was going to be Tolreim the Deshen. Because of that, they instituted the pious, but not because it really needs, because theoretically you wouldn't need it. It's a night activity. Any night activities, again, are a lower level, so they seem to not need a pious. But now we're going to ask another inference from here that's going to raise a question. Lememra, the avodat yom, v'shezal chayav alav mita, alea mita, by a pious, which would then, right, what did he say? Rav Asi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Zar that put the two gzirei etzim is chayav because it's avodat yom, it's chayav mita, and it was a day activity. So now we're going to, and then Rava said that assumes they need pious. So now we're going to say, are you trying to say avodat yom? It has to have all these criteria. If it's a day activity, and a non-Kohen's going to get death penalty if he does it, then those are the requirements for pious, and which means the reverse or the converse, in zar chayav alei mita, lo by a pious. But if the zar is not obligated death penalty, then he's not going to need a lottery. And I'll show you a case where if a zar does it, he's not obligated death. In fact, he's allowed to do it, and yet there's still a pious. V'harei shchita. Remember, shchita, you're allowed, and a zar is allowed to do. Forget that he doesn't get the death penalty. He's permitted, and yet there's still a lottery for it. So the answer, because remember, general, the Kohanim did do the shchita in the temple, even though a non-Kohen was allowed to. Only on Pesach they really did it. It was unlikely they did it most other times. Sometimes you could, but in general, the Kohanim were the ones who slaughtered. So they say again, shani shchita detchila avodahi. Again, shchita is different because it leads into the rest of the avodah. So that's why it needs a pious. It's part of the main activities. Amar Marzutra v'item Rav Ashi. So now comes Marzutra, and he asks another question. V'hanan lo tznan hachi. But wait, we didn't learn that. What did we learn? Amar lahem ha'memuneh. Tzeu u're'u im higia zman hashchita. V'ilu zman shnei gzirei etzim lo katane. Now he's going to have another question. This was assuming the shnei gzirei etzim was during the day. But that was what Rabbi Yochanan said in the second reading. He said, since it's avodat yom. Who says it's avodat yom? Look, it says, the mimuneh came, this was in Masechet Tamid, and what did he say? He said, go outside on the roof and go see if it's time we can start slaughtering. Check if the sun is risen. But what doesn't it say there? It doesn't say check so that we can put Shnei Gzirei Eitzim on the altar. Sounds like you do that at night. So what do they answer? Hach delele takanta katane. Hach deile takanta lo katane. If you did the Shnei Gzirei Eitzim at night, it was okay. It doesn't need to be fixed. If you did the Shechita by accident at night, you would need to redo it. It wouldn't work. So therefore, it only mentions things that must be done during the day. And the assumption is, and the Mepharshim talk about that, the idea is, from the temple, they had windows. They could see that the sun had risen. But sometimes it might have been the moonlight. So how do they make sure? They go up on the roof. But you only go up on the roof for things that you have to be absolutely certain that it's day. If by accident you do something at night because you thought it was day and it works, it's fine. The Shnei Gzirei Eitzim are supposed to be done during the day. They really are avodat yom. But if you did them at night, it'll be fine anyway. And that's why it's not mentioned here, but yet it's still an avodat yom. And with that, we resolve that other question on Rabbi Yochanan. V'ika da'amri. Now we're going to go back to the first reading of Rabbi Asi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. He said, let's just go back to the beginning. As we had, Zar shesiyeret hamaracha chayav. Remember, if he sets up the maracha, which in the second reading we said it's not the maracha, it's the Shnei Gzirei Eitzim, and that's because it's avodat yom. But here it says the base where the wood goes, those 2 rows of wood, those also, not the 2 logs, but the 2 rows, those have to be set up by a kohen. And if a zar does it, he gets mavet. And then Rav Zera asked, but do you have a work that you can do during the day, and I'm sorry, that you can do at night, and yet it's a zar can't do it? To which the Gemara now brings a different version of his question. V'ika da'amri. And with that, we'll finish for today. Matkif la Rabbi Zera. Could you have a job that isn't the full job? When you put those 2 rows of wood, you still haven't put the 2 logs on top. So you haven't even finished the job. Could there be something that you haven't actually finished the job and you're not going to let a non-Kohen do? In other words, who cares? That's just the laying the groundwork. If the Kohen will put the 2 logs on top, so why are you saying that you're going to get the death penalty if a regular person does it? Because it's not even a full job. It's just a partial job. Okay. And that's what we're going to end with today. And we'll pick up Sunday morning with the next, with the answer to that, or the continuation of this discussion. So have a Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov to everyone.